Chapter 1. The Wind over Eurasia. Before there were cities, before empires rose or fell, before names like Rome or China held any meaning, there were paths. Not the paved kind, but soft tracks pressed into the earth by bare feet and wandering hooves. These were the first highways of humankind, carved not by ambition or conquest, but by need. They wove through forests and valleys, over hills and along rivers, shaped by wind, water, and the slow instinct of movement. In the heart of Eurasia, an immense body of land, stretching from the rainy green of Western Europe to the high sun deserts of what we now call China, early humans were already walking. Tens of thousands of years ago, the last ice age began to loosen its grip. The glaciers retreated, and the land opened like a sleeping giant, slowly stirring. Into this awakening world came small bands of people, hunters and gatherers, who chased the herds and followed the seasons. They moved not with plans, but with rhythm, the rhythm of survival. Rivers were their guides, mountains their boundaries. The stars lit their way at night. Across the steppes of Central Asia and through the wooded valleys of the Caucasus they left signs of their passing, bone tools, ash from fire pits, and later the marks of trade. Because even in these earliest days humans were not only wanderers, they were exchangers. Long before silk, jade, or gold, there were tools of flint, shells from distant shores, and the first seeds of trade, a carved stone from a mountain traded for a chunk of obsidian. A necklace made from animal teeth swapped for a blade that held a sharper edge. These exchanges were not formal, not recorded, but they tell a story older than words. A story of movement, a story of connection. The silk road then did not begin with silk. It began with footsteps, millions of them pressing into snow, into sand, into soil, softened by spring rains. It began with a gesture, an open hand, an offered gift, a shared need. These were the prehistoric highways of Eurasia, silent, unwritten, and alive, a continent without borders. Eurasia was never meant to be divided. Its landscapes defied barriers. Great rivers like the Amu Darya and the Yellow River flowed not according to human law, but to gravity and time. Mountains like the Tian Shan or the Altai loomed not as borders, but as backbones, challenging and connecting all at once. Between them stretched grasslands wide as oceans, deserts golden and shifting, and forests dense with life. Here geography was not an obstacle, it was a guide. The grasslands of the Eurasian steppe formed a nearly unbroken belt stretching thousands of miles from Hungary to Manchuria. These were the pastures of wild horses and swift antelope, and later the domain of riders who would one day carry messages, goods, and empires across vast distances. The steppes were nature's highway, flat, open, endlessly rolling, a land where horizons seemed to breathe. To the south, the great deserts, Karakum, Kizilkum, and Taklamakan, held their own wisdom. They taught travelers to move with caution, to follow the stars, to know the rhythm of water and shade. Those who learned their ways could cross them, those who didn't vanished. Yet these lands were not empty. They teemed with life. In the valleys near rivers, early settlements flourished, clusters of reed huts or mud brick homes, places where seeds were planted and harvests drawn. People learned to watch the skies, to listen to the land, and to trade what they had for what they needed. One village had fish, another salt, one made pottery, another tamed sheep. The land itself encouraged movement. There were no passports, no customs stations. Boundaries were drawn by rivers and memory, not by law. What mattered was the path, where it led, and who could follow it. These were the beginnings of connection. A continent not chopped into pieces, but held together by wind, water, and will. The Silk Road would one day be mapped onto this living canvas, but the canvas had always been ready, waiting, salt, stones, and seeds. What did they carry, those early traders who crossed mountains or deserts with little more than animals and hope? It was not silk. That would come later. It was not gold or ivory. No, these earliest exchanges were humbler and more essential. They carried salt. Not in great slabs, but in handfuls, crystals gathered from dry lakes or ocean spray. Salt was life. Salt preserved meat and made hard water drinkable. In a world without refrigeration, salt was treasure. A single pouch of it could buy days of food or win a traveller safe passage through a village. They carried stones, obsidian, flint, jade. Obsidian, in particular, was prized for its sharpness, its ability to cut cleaner than any bone or wood. It was the glass of the ancient world, and long before the Silk Road, trails of obsidian moved east and west across the land like whispers. Archaeologists have found obsidian from Anatolia in the highlands of Iran and from Central Asia as far west as Mesopotamia. The stones travelled even when their carriers didn't, and they carried seeds. Not just any seeds, but millet, barley, wheat, grains that had been tamed by human hands and coaxed to grow in foreign soil. A seed is a quiet gift. It speaks of patience, of future meals, of a connection between people and land. When seeds moved, they didn't just trade nutrition, they traded ideas. A seed from the east told of a farming technique. A grain from the west hinted at a new way to bake bread. Culture, like crops, spread through soil. These exchanges were not done on parchment scrolls or recorded in stone, but they mattered. A trader may have walked from one village to another, carrying a sack of millet. In that sack, hidden in plain sight, was transformation. In a bundle of salt was the ability to survive. In a shard of obsidian, the power to hunt or defend. These were the goods of the world before currency. Not luxuries, but lifelines. Echoes of the first caravans, imagine them, not as the painted caravans of later centuries, but smaller, quieter processions, a few animals, a handful of people. Faces weathered by wind, hands hardened by work. They moved not under banners, but under sky. They did not march with soldiers, but with memory. Perhaps it began with a hunter who knew a path through the mountains, and a friend who had heard of a village across the hills with better grain. Or perhaps a group of herders followed their animals into unknown valleys and found others who spoke in strange tongues but smiled with the same warmth. Trade was born in trust, in the space between fear and hope. They would have carried little, but what they carried mattered. Not only salt or stone, but stories. Where the river bends, where wolves hunt, where to find the hidden well beneath a rock shaped like a sleeping dog. These stories were passed down, and soon paths became trails. Trails became routes, and the idea of the road, a thread stretched between people, took root. These first caravans did not know they were carving history. They knew only the rhythm of the land, the sound of hooves, the wind that rose at dawn, the silence of a desert at dusk. Their names are lost, their destinations forgotten, but the echoes remain. In the rustle of desert winds, in the silence of grassy plains, in the ruins of forgotten camps, there is a whisper. It says, "Someone passed this way before. Someone dared the unknown, not for conquest, but for connection. These were the ones who walked before silk, before fame, before history. They were not looking to be remembered, they were looking to survive, and in doing so they began a road that would one day stretch across the world." Chapter 2. Horses, Wheels, and War Bows. In the open silence of the Central Asian steppes, where grass bends like waves beneath the wind and the sky stretches endlessly above, something quietly shifted. It was not the rise of a kingdom, nor the fall of an empire. It was the moment a wild creature met a human gaze and did not run. That creature was the horse. Long before saddles, long before steel, humans and horses came face to face in the lands we now call Kazakhstan. These early horses, smaller and more muscular than those we know today, were wild and swift, living in herds across the open grasslands. For thousands of years people hunted them, but over time the relationship began to change. Around 5,000 years ago, humans did something new. They began to tame the horse. At first, it was not for riding, but for meat and milk. Mare's milk, fermented into a drink called kumis, became a staple in steppe life. But then someone, no name recorded, no monument left, climbed on to the back of a horse and held on. It was awkward at first, but slowly riding was born. This moment was not just a leap in transportation, it was a revolution in movement, vision, and culture. For the first time, humans could cross vast distances not in days but hours. They could hunt more efficiently, patrol wider territories, and escape danger with speed. And so a new kind of society emerged, one built not on walls but on motion. Children were raised in tents but lived under skies. They grew up knowing the feel of reins in hand, the rhythm of hooves beneath them. The horse was no longer just an animal, it was memory, strength, survival. It was part of the body, part of the tribe. Burial sites from this era tell us much. Men and women alike were buried with their horses laid side by side as companions for the next life. Horse bones were carved into tools and ornaments there. Images were painted on rock walls and carved into bone. These were not just riders, they were horse people. In these early steppe cultures, the horse was more than transportation. It was identity. And through this bond, the first horse cultures rose not to conquer but to move, to live as the wind does, always in motion across the breathing lands of Eurasia. The bow that bends and breaks empires. The horse gave speed, but it was the bow that gave reach. Among the many tools shaped by early hands on the steppe, none carried more silent power than the recurved composite bow. This was no simple branch pulled to tension. The composite bow was an intricate craft, a layered weapon made from wood, horn, and sinew. It bent backward when unstrung, a shape that seemed unnatural, but gave it deadly strength. Small enough to carry on horseback, yet strong enough to punch through armor, it changed everything. No one knows the name of its first maker, but its echoes have touched history. The bow was more than a weapon, it was a philosophy of war, a way of fighting not by brute force but by speed, agility, and precision. The steppe nomads learned to fire while riding, first at still targets, then on the move, and finally while galloping. It took years to master, but once they did, they became shadows with teeth, invisible until they struck. The thrum of a bowstring became a warning in the wind. Empires built behind walls were shaken. The composite bow gave small groups of riders the ability to defeat larger armies bound by ground and formation. The Scythians, Parthians, and later the Huns, Turks and Mongols all wielded this bow like a whisper that broke silence, a stroke that undid cities. But this bow was not just used for conquest, it was also a tool of survival. Hunters used it to feed families. Shepherds used it to defend flocks. Children were trained from youth, their small fingers learning the pull and release. The bow became a symbol of readiness, of awareness, of a people always watching the horizon. There is poetry in the way it bends, a contradiction, strength in tension, power through flexibility, much like the people who used it. To understand the composite bow is to understand the heart of the steppe warrior, silent, mobile, fierce, and always, always in motion. Chariots, warriors, and the nomadic code. Before riders ruled the grasslands, it was the chariot that thundered across ancient battlefields. Drawn by horses rolling on wooden wheels bound by leather, the chariot brought speed to early warfare. It was a platform for archers, a stage for noble duels, but it needed roads, it needed flat land, it needed maintenance. The steppe, with its wild terrain and constant motion, soon made chariots impractical, and so the horseman replaced the wheel. One warrior on horseback could move faster, travel lighter, and fight in more places than any chariot could reach. This shift changed not only how wars were fought, but who fought them. The rise of cavalry gave birth to a new kind of warrior society. These were not armies recruited by kings, but tribes of fighters, men and women raised in the saddle, trained by the land, bonded by honor. Every member had a role. Elders passed down stories and tactics. Children practiced riding before they could run. The bow, the spear, the curved saber, all were extensions of the body. To be a warrior was not to be a soldier. It was to live with a sense of duty, not just to fight, but to protect, to provide, to lead. And from this life grew a code. It was not written in books or proclaimed in courts. It was passed by firelight and sealed with shared meals, respect for elders, loyalty to the tribe, mercy to the weak, bravery in the face of odds. These values shaped the steppe nomads as surely as the wind shaped their plains. These warriors were not always conquerors. Many served as guardians of trade, protectors of caravans, or guides across dangerous lands. Their skills were not just feared. They were hired, admired, and even absorbed by the empires they once fought. The transition from chariots to cavalry was not just a change in tools. It was a transformation in how people lived, moved, and remembered. The wheel gave way to the hoof. The driver gave way to the rider. And the world would never be the same. What it means to be a nomad. To be a nomad is to live in motion, but it is also to live with intention. Not wandering without aim, but moving with meaning, guided by seasons, by need, and by memory. A nomad wakes with the sun, not behind stone walls, but beneath the soft canvas of a tent. The wind speaks first. The land decides the day. Children rise with chores, fires are lit, milk is boiled, and animals are checked before the first step is taken. This life is not fast, it is steady. Their homes are light, made to be packed and carried. Their songs are soft, made to carry on the wind. Their stories are long, made to last through miles. Everything a nomad owns they must carry. Everything they carry they must value. In this way, the material becomes sacred, not because it is rich, but because it is chosen. The land is both home and map. Hills are not barriers, but markers. Rivers are not borders, but lifelines. Stars are not decorations, but directions. To be a nomad is to read the world like a book and know that every turn of the page is a new day of learning. Their identity is not built on buildings, but on movement. Culture is preserved not in monuments, but in rituals, in how a saddle is made, how a fire is built, how a child is named. These are quiet traditions, passed down like breath. Even in conflict, nomads remember the land. Battles are fought, but never in waste. Food is shared, even with strangers. Water is offered, even in drought. This is survival shaped by ethics, an unwritten law stronger than steel. To be a nomad is not to lack. It is to carry enough. Not to settle, but to belong wherever the sky meets the earth. It is to live as the horse lives, not behind fences, but beneath stars. It is to measure wealth not in coin, but in stories, memories, and freedom. As the Silk Road grew, these nomads became its guardians, its guides, its invisible architects. The road was built not just by merchants or emperors, but by riders who knew the wind, who moved with the seasons, and who called the whole step home. Chapter 3. The Parthian Thunder. The desert stretched in every direction, a vast, pale canvas of wind and dust. There were no trees, no shadows, only the endless shimmer of heat. It was here, in 53 BCE, near the ancient town of Karhai, that two empires would clash like distant thunder, finally meeting over open ground. On one side stood the Roman Republic, proud and certain, led by Marcus Licinius Crassus, wealthy, ambitious, and aching for glory. On the other, the Parthian Empire, quiet but deadly, with warriors forged by sand and silence. Crassus marched eastward with 7 legions, nearly 40,000 men strong, believing he would conquer as easily as Caesar in Gaul or Pompey in the Levant. But the desert does not obey maps, and the Parthians did not play by Roman rules. They came with no heavy armor, no tight formations. Instead, they rode like wind. Horse archers, dressed in light mail, flowed across the sand with speed the Romans could not match. Their bows, composite and recurved, sang a high, terrifying note as arrows darkened the sky. Crassus ordered the testudo, the Roman shield formation, a dome of iron, to stop the storm. But the arrows kept falling. Over hours the sun beat down and the Romans began to suffocate inside their own protection. Water ran low. Confidence bled into fear. Then came the cataphracts, Parthian heavy cavalry, thundering across the plain. Armored head to hoof, they struck the Roman flanks like waves of iron. The Roman lines, meant for close combat, buckled under a war they had never fought before, mobile, precise, relentless. Crassus watched his army unravel. His son was killed, his officers confused, and his soldiers panicked. In a desperate attempt at parley, Crassus approached the Parthians under a white flag, but trust had long since vanished. The meeting turned into a trap. Crassus was killed, and with him the pride of a Roman generation. Only a fraction of the army made it back. Carrhae was more than a defeat. It was a humiliation. But more than that, it was an awakening. Rome had seen the face of the East, not in temples or silks, but in arrows and wind. And somewhere amid that devastation, the seeds of obsession were sown, because as the dust settled, something glittered among the fallen, banners of flowing silk that shimmered like water under the sun. A banner made of silk. There are whispers, half lost in time, of the Parthian riders unfurling banners unlike anything the Romans had seen, long fluttering cloth that danced even when the air was still. It moved like light, it shimmered like stars, and it held colour with a depth unknown in the West. It was silk. To Roman eyes, hardened by bronze and leather, this fabric felt like sorcery. It rippled with an elegance that armour could not contain. On the battlefield, the banners shimmered not just as decoration, but as a message. Here was something rare, something beyond reach. Silk was already known to Rome, just barely. Traders whispered of it. Small bolts of it passed hand to hand, travelling from east to west, changing owners dozens of times before reaching Roman markets. But to see it in the hands of warriors, to see it flying above a cavalry charge, that was different. That was unforgettable. Some say it was the silk that lingered in Roman minds longer than the defeat itself. The battle was a scar, but the silk was a dream of something delicate yet strong, soft yet powerful. It became a symbol not of Parthian terror, but of Eastern wonder, and in that moment a transformation began. Silk stopped being just a fabric. It became a mystery, a goal, a reason to reach farther into the world. For if people who could defeat Rome carried banners like these, what other treasures lay beyond? The banner waved only briefly above Cari, but it etched itself into memory, not through sound or battle cries, but through the quiet promise of beauty born far from Rome, carried by wind and never forgotten. The silk that slipped through shields. After Cari, the Parthians did not press westward. They did not try to conquer Rome. Instead, they held their place, a bridge between empires, and they began to use silk not as a symbol, but as a tool. They knew the Romans wanted it. The nobles, the generals, even the emperors began to hunger for its touch. But the road to China was long and dangerous, a chain of deserts, mountains, and changing hands. Few Romans could travel that far. The Parthians didn't need to go the whole way, they only needed to control the middle. From their capital at Ctesiphon and through trade cities like Hekatompelos and Merv, the Parthians became masters of the middle ground. They welcomed merchants from the east, Sogdians, Bactrians and Chinese, and from the west, Greeks, Syrians and Romans. They taxed goods, offered security, and allowed the silk to move, but only through them. Silk flowed like a river through a narrow pass. The Parthians controlled the pass. They carried the silk not on great ships or in royal caravans, but in quiet bundles hidden among spices and dyes. Each thread passed through many hands, and with each exchange its price rose. By the time it reached Rome, it cost its weight in gold. Rome could not break this control. Military efforts failed. Diplomacy faltered, and so they accepted it. Silk entered Rome not with armies, but in the packs of traders protected by Parthian grace. In this way the Parthians did what the Roman legions could not. They bent an empire to their will without lifting a sword. Silk became their whisper, their shadow, their quiet form of dominance. It moved behind shields, beneath cloaks into palaces, and through it the Parthians shaped history, not by conquest, but by connection, gold for thread. Rome wanted silk desperately, not for armor, not for building, but for something more intimate, luxury. It clothed the wives of senators, it wrapped the bodies of courtesans, it lined the garments of emperors. To wear silk was to be noticed, to be admired, to be envied. But silk was scarce and its path was long. So Rome paid in gold. Coin after coin left its treasury, passed into foreign hands, and vanished into the east. The flow became a flood. Some senators, concerned by the drain of wealth, called it madness. They claimed Rome was being hollowed from within by a hunger for softness, but no decree could stop it. Demand only grew. Silk became a currency of its own. Bribery, dowry, tribute, reward. It was more than fabric. It was status. Even a small scarf could mark someone as elite. In the markets of Antioch and Tyre, silk was displayed like treasure. Behind closed doors, deals were made. Traders risked their lives to cross deserts. Caravans vanished into the sands and never returned. But still the silk came, and it came not just from China, but from 1,000 hands along the road, from women who spun it in the east to men who carried it across the steppes, from Parthians who counted every bolt and taxed every mile, from merchants who bought it low and sold it high. The journey was long, but the reward was sure. Rome gave gold, the East gave thread, and between them a silent agreement was born, not of politics or treaty, but of desire. This trade would not stop, not with war, not with warning. It had taken root deep in the Roman soul, and through it the Silk Road became more than geography. It became longing, it became legend, and it all began on a battlefield with arrows in the air and silk on the wind. Chapter 4. Han Against the Wind. In the open plains north of China's heartland, where the winds never sleep and the sky seems endless, there lived a people without cities, without walls, and without fear. They were the Xiongnu, riders of the steppe, archers of the horizon, and ghosts to the settled world. To the early Han emperors, they were not just a threat. They were a question with no easy answer. The Xiongnu came with the dawn, silent at first, then roaring like a storm. They struck fast, on horseback, with bows that curved and sang through the air. Their raids swept into Chinese farmlands, burning, taking, then vanishing back into the northern grasslands before the soldiers could even mount a proper response. They needed no roads, they built no temples, they worshipped the sky and rode as if the wind carried them. Their power was not in numbers, but in speed and precision. They could live for days without food, survive on dried meat and fermented milk, and travel farther in a single day than most armies in a week. To the settled minds of the Han, the Xiongnu were chaos, unruly, shifting, unstoppable. But to themselves they were heirs of the steppe. Their loyalty was to kin and tribe. Their memory lived in songs, not scrolls. Their war was not about conquest, it was about survival. They moved with the herds, followed the seasons, and fought when threatened or tempted by wealth. China, with its deep traditions and orderly towns, could not understand this freedom. They offered peace, gifts, even marriage alliances. Sometimes the Xiongnu accepted. Other times they laughed. To bow meant to submit, and the horse lords bowed to no one. Their riders came like shadows. Their camps vanished overnight. Their arrows were messages: stay back, stay weak, or be ready to bleed. For decades, the Han paid in silk and grain, hoping the tide would turn. But the steppe does not yield to waiting. It demands change, and so the horse lords kept riding, unbound, unbroken, and unafraid. Walls of earth, riders of sky. Faced with the relentless raids, China turned to its oldest defense, the wall. Not one wall, but many, stitched together across the northern frontier like a patchwork spine. Built of earth and stone, these walls stretched for hundreds of miles, tracing ridgelines and riverbanks, rising in the dust as a message to the north, this far and no farther. The wall was not just a barrier, it was a belief. It stood for order, permanence, and protection. Watchtowers were spaced along its length, their flames ready to send warnings by night. Soldiers manned the ramparts, staring into the wind, waiting for riders who might never come. But the wall could not move, and the riders could. The Xiongnu bypassed it, circled it, rode through mountain passes or deserts untouched by bricks. They didn't attack the wall directly, they made it irrelevant. For every fort built, there was a new path through the wilderness. For every patrol launched, the steppe offered 1,000 hiding places, and yet the wall remained. It was more than a defense, it was a symbol. It said that China would not vanish beneath hooves, that civilization would hold, but even the most loyal generals knew that walls could not win wars. They could delay, they could mark lines, but they could not chase, they could not surprise, they could not adapt. The Xiongnu had shown the Han what power looked like in a world of horses. And slowly, painfully, China began to see. To stop the wind, one must ride with it, when the Han took to the saddle. At first the thought was strange. Chinese, warriors on horseback chasing nomads across the steppe. For centuries the Han had relied on chariots, drawn by teams of horses, elegant but heavy. Chariots were for parades, for battles fought on flat land, under command. But the steppe was not flat, the wind did not follow plans. The turning point came not with philosophy, but with necessity. The Han began to lose too much. Too many border villages burned. Too many soldiers died before ever drawing swords. The court could not ignore it. Something had to change, and so they learned. They studied the nomads, how they moved, how they fought, how they lived. They hired Xiongnu defectors as trainers. They brought in Central Asian horses faster and stronger than their own. Young recruits were taught to ride not in lines but in waves. To shoot while galloping, to live off the land, it was not easy. Years passed before the new cavalry earned respect. There were failures, ambushes, and long marches that ended in silence, but slowly the transformation took root. By the time Emperor Wu Hanwudi came to power, the change was ready. He was bold, determined, and unafraid to spend treasure for victory. He gave generals full authority, poured resources into breeding horses, and launched military campaigns deep into the steppe. Now, when the Xiongnu struck, they found an answer waiting, not behind walls, but on horseback. The Han cavalry was not yet as fluid as the nomads, but it was growing sharper, faster, more confident. The prey had become the hunter. In the cold morning mist of the frontier, something had changed. The sound of galloping hooves no longer meant panic, it meant pursuit. The wind still blew, but China had learned to ride with it. The silence after. Victory. The final campaign came like a long-held breath released. In a series of bold strikes, Han Wudi's generals pushed deep into Xiongnu territory. They didn't just defend, they attacked. They seized water sources, scattered camps, and took prisoners. They stayed for months at a time, refusing to retreat. The Xiongnu, used to short raids and quick escapes, began to falter. Their herds were lost, their unity strained. Some tribes surrendered, others fled further north. The steppe was still wide, but it no longer felt endless. With each victory, the Han cleared a corridor, not just for armies, but for ideas, for trade, for silk. This route, carved by hooves and hardened by blood, would become the foundation of the Silk Road. But the silence that followed was not a song of triumph. It was heavier, deeper. The frontier grew still. Forts that once rang with alarms now stood quiet. Soldiers returned home, traders crept forward, and for a moment there was peace. It was not the end of struggle. The steppe would rise again in other names, other tribes, but for now the door had opened. What lay beyond it was unknown, but the wind that once carried only war now carried whispers of something else. Commerce, culture, connection. The Han had met the horsemen, not with walls alone, but with motion. They had learned not just to resist the wind, but to ride with it. And in doing so, they unlocked a road that would carry silk, stories, and strangers across the known world. Chapter 5. Roads of Jade and Bone. In the high silence of the western deserts, the wind carries whispers of stories long buried in sand. Once, these lands lay beyond the known world of China, far-off regions of jagged peaks, salt flats, and endless sky. Yet for the Han dynasty, the draw of the West was irresistible. Not because of conquest alone, but because beyond the horizon lay opportunity. Connection. A new world waiting to unfold. Under Emperor Wu of Han, bold missions began pushing into the unknown. The most famous among them was led by Zhang Qian, a diplomat sent west not for war, but for knowledge. He was captured, escaped, and wandered for years. But when he returned, his words painted a vast picture of distant lands filled with horses, grapes, and cities beyond the mountains. His journey, though filled with hardship, gave China its first real map of Central Asia. It was no longer myth. It was reachable. Following these accounts, caravans began to form. First a few, then many. They carried silk westward, smooth, gleaming, and light. In return, horses came east, sturdy and tall, prized for their strength and spirit. Jade moved. Too, carved and gleaming, often passed hand to hand like treasure in the sun. But this movement was never simple. The land was not kind. Deserts tested every step. Mountains closed roads in winter. Bandits watched from hidden valleys. And yet they went. Why? Because the western regions were more than trade. They were the edge of discovery, the unknown. And for the Han, this edge was no longer something to fear. It was a direction, a purpose, a calling. The gates to the west had not yet opened, but the wind was rising and it blew westward. The Jade Gate opens carved into the sands. Of Gansu, far beyond the walls of imperial China, stood Yumenguan, the Jade Gate Pass. A name poetic and precise, for jade, the precious stone of eternity, once passed through here, heading eastward into the hands of Chinese craftsmen and emperors. But now the gate looked the other way, toward the lands beyond. Yumenguan was not a gate in the grand sense, no towering arch, no gilded door. It was a fortress of tamped earth and stone, worn by sun and wind, crouched low near the edge of the Taklamakan desert. Yet what it represented was vast. It was the line between the world of the Han and the unknown stretches of Central Asia. For traders, it marked departure. For soldiers, it marked duty. For monks and messengers, it marked transition from the known to the mysterious. Here, travel permits were issued. Caravan records were kept. Dust-covered travellers arrived with salt in their cloaks and windburn on their faces. Horses drank deeply from shallow wells. The hum of many tongues echoed off baked walls, Chinese, Sogdian, Tokharian, and more. It was a place of crossing, not only of goods, but of people and stories. The Jade Gate was not merely a checkpoint. It was a symbol. To pass through it was to say, I leave the comfort of empire, and I step into the wide breadth of the world. And many did just that, for trade, for faith, for curiosity. Even now, standing in ruins, its silence remains powerful. A silent sentinel watching the road it once guarded. The gate is still there, weathered and worn, but patient, waiting, as if still listening to the footsteps of all who passed through on their way to some place new. Desert monks and silk scrolls. As the Silk Road came alive, something unexpected followed the merchants. Silence. Not the silence of death or distance, but of prayer. Along the edge of the deserts, far from courts and markets, monasteries began to rise, small, carved into cliffs, or low, built from earth and hope. In these lonely places, Buddhism began to spread westward and eastward. The desert, harsh as it was, became a place of refuge for monks. They found in its vastness a mirror for meditation. In its silence, the rhythm of walking and chanting became sacred. And soon, the Silk Road was not only a corridor of trade, it became a river of faith. At Dunhuang, near the Jade Gate, an oasis flourished into something more. Caves were carved into the sandstone, dozens, then hundreds. Within, murals bloomed. On walls, scripture was written on silk and paper. Images of bodhisattvas, cloud-walkers, and lotus realms adorned every surface. Pilgrims came, and so did scribes. They copied sutras, translated texts, painted visions of paradise beneath flickering oil lamps. It was here that the voices of India, China, and Central Asia met, not in argument, but in harmony. The road that once carried bolts of silk now carried mantras. The same path that moved jade and horses now moved enlightenment. The monks did not fight to spread their message. They walked, slowly, softly, carrying scrolls tucked beneath robes, speaking only when asked, sharing only what was sought. And the desert listened. These monasteries were more than shelters. They were libraries, sanctuaries, schools. And in their quiet way, they shaped the Silk Road just as much as merchants and kings. For where trade stops, prayer begins, and where the body rests, the spirit often rises. The silent witness of bones, in the shifting sands west of the Jade Gate, the wind sometimes uncovers more than dust. It brushes away centuries to reveal fragments of those who walked long ago, bones, broken tools, faded letters on brittle paper. Not heroes or emperors, but people, travellers, the ordinary souls who risked the journey. Archaeologists today find their remains with reverence, a torn shoe left by someone who walked too far, a comb made from bone, its teeth worn smooth by time, coins stamped with faces long forgotten, and letters, fragile and dry but still legible, written in languages now barely known. One speaks of loneliness, another of trade gone bad, another still of longing for home. These were not great declarations, just voices, soft, human, and real. Some travellers died where they walked. The desert took them. A wrong turn, a storm, an empty flask. But even in death they tell us something, that the road was real, that the cost was high, that the Silk Road was not just lined with gold and wisdom, but paved in risk and effort, and through their remains we glimpse not just history, but humanity. The road was not made by rulers, but by footsteps, one by one, each leaving something behind. The bones do not speak, but they do not need to. They remind us that every journey, every crossing, every trade, every prayer was made by a person, someone with a name, a dream, and a reason to keep walking. As the sun sets behind the western cliffs of Dunhuang, the wind blows softly across the sand. And in that wind, perhaps, the bones still whisper. Chapter 6. The Kushan Crossroads. Beneath the silent mountains of the Hindu Kush and the shimmering plains of northern India, there once thrived an empire that bridged the world, neither entirely Eastern nor wholly Western, but something in between. It was called the Kushan Empire, and though its name is often overlooked in the grand sweep of history, its role was anything but small. Emerging in the 1st century CE, the Kushans rose from a lineage of nomads, descendants of the Yuezhi people, who had migrated from the steppes of Central Asia. When they settled in the fertile valleys of Bactria, in what is now northern Afghanistan, something remarkable began to take shape. They did not conquer to erase, they conquered to connect. Their land was a meeting place of worlds, where India's great rivers met Persia's highlands, where Chinese silk met Roman gold, and where caravans slowed just long enough for ideas to mingle. This geography gave them power, but it was their openness that gave them legacy. Kushan rulers did not simply tolerate different cultures, they welcomed them. They governed in many tongues, minted coins with Greek deities on one side and Indian gods on the other. Their kings called themselves by many titles: Shah, Devaputra, Maharaja, signs not of confusion but of fusion. Their empire was stitched together not by walls or iron, but by movement. Movement of goods, movement of faiths, movement of people. This land of middle worlds, the Silk Road, did not pass through. It paused, it breathed, it changed. And in that stillness a crossroads was born, a place where cultures didn't collide. They wove Sanskrit, silk, and sculptures. At the southern fringe of the Silk Road, where dusty trade routes met the edges of lush forests, and temple bells echoed at dawn, the Kushan world came alive in layers, linguistic, spiritual, and artistic. Sanskrit was spoken in courts and carved into stone, not as a language of one people, but as a bridge among many. Greek was still used on coins, but Sanskrit gave the empire soul. In it, The teachings of the Buddha were recorded. In it, dramas were performed. It was a language old and wise, but in the Kushan lands it was also alive. Silk flowed here too, woven. In China, coloured in India, traded in markets from Merv to Mathura. But it wasn't just cloth, it became canvas. Artists painted on silk, sewed stories into robes, and draped temples in translucent waves of colour. Silk in Kushan cities was not merely worn, it was seen, touched, adored. And then there was sculpture. Along the trade routes in cities like Gandhara, something astonishing emerged, a new art. Buddhist statues began to take shape in ways never seen before. The serene face of the Buddha, once abstract and symbolic, now bore the gentle curves of the human form. Robes were carved to look like they flowed. Faces bore Greco-Roman softness. Hair curled like Apollo's. Hands rested in Indian mudras of peace and blessing. This was Gandharan art, a miracle of fusion, Greek technique, Persian influence, Indian soul. It was not forced, it was not copied. It was born from the meeting of worlds. Temples stood with domes from Persia, pillars from India, and murals in colours traded from China. And in their shadow, traders, monks and musicians mingled. Here, at the Kushan crossroads, silk and sculpture were not separate. They were part of the same story. A story told in many tongues, carved in many styles, yet speaking one quiet truth. Beauty grows where roads meet. Jade to Buddha, gold to the sky. In the Kushan world, the markets told stories even when the people were silent. Traders spread out, their wares beneath woven canopies, dust swirling in the morning breeze, laughter echoing through the bazaars. But what they sold was more than goods, it was identity. Jade, green as forest shadows, came from the east. Carved into amulets or offered as tribute, it often travelled westward to be placed at the feet of the Buddha or embedded into statues. It had no homeland. It belonged to those who valued patience, peace, and permanence. Gold flowed in the other direction, gleaming, warm, divine. Kushan coins were stamped with deities, both familiar and foreign. Some bore the image of Shiva, others of Helios, the sun god. To hold such a coin was to hold a map of belief. It could be spent in a Roman villa or placed as an offering in an Indian shrine. Temples rose from this exchange, places where jade and gold met sky. In cities like Sur-Kotal or Takhti-Bahi, monasteries stood high on ridges, their walls painted with floral patterns and their sanctuaries glowing with lamps made from traded oils. Pilgrims travelled days to reach them, and when they arrived, they left more than prayers. They left stories, tokens, and memories. Kushan cities did not hide religion. They showcased it. Shrines to Shiva stood beside Buddhist stupas. Zoroastrian fire altars burned not in defiance, but in harmony. Here, gods were not rivals. They were neighbours. From the lowest market alley to the highest temple courtyard, the Kushan world shimmered with relics, with rituals, with roads that carried not only goods, but grace. A language of trade and prayer. The Silk Road was paved not just with stone, but with speech. And nowhere was this more true than in the Kushan Empire. Caravans came from many directions, each bringing its own tongue. Greek, spoken by merchants from the west, Prakrit and Sanskrit from Indian scholars, Bactrian, and Sogdian from Central Asia. Even Chinese could be heard in hushed barters at the edge of the stalls, and yet they understood each other, not because they shared a single language, but because they shared purpose. Trade was a language of its own, a glance, a gesture, a drawn figure in the sand, but even deeper than trade was prayer, and it too had a language, slow, sacred, repeated under breath. Monks recited sutras in Sanskrit. Zoroastrian priests whispered in Avestan. Pilgrims sang mantras passed down from mountain caves. The Kushan kings, wise to this chorus of tongues, minted coins with inscriptions in Greek, but also in Bactrian, a local language written in Greek script. It was a symbol, not of dominance, but of inclusion. And perhaps this was the empire's quiet genius. It did not demand unity, it invited harmony. A merchant from Antioch could walk through a Kushan town and find his coins accepted, his gods respected, and his voice heard. A monk from Kashmir could teach under a fig tree beside a Greek philosopher, and both would be given space to speak. In a world often divided by borders, the Kushan lands were different. They were not a wall. They were a road, and on that road, languages met not to conquer, but to connect. Chapter 7. Secrets of the Silk. In the shaded mulberry groves of ancient China, beneath the quiet rustle of leaves and the warmth of spring sun, a delicate transformation was taking place. On the underside of a single leaf, a pale thread was being spun, thin, glistening, and alive. The creature behind this miracle was small, almost invisible from a distance. Yet its gift would change the world. The silkworm, Bombyx mori, was no ordinary insect. It was a weaver of empires. For centuries, China guarded the creature and the process it inspired as a sacred secret, hidden not in vaults, but in tradition, law, and silence. The art of sericulture, or silk production, was more than farming. It was a symphony of nature and human care. It began with the mulberry tree, its leaves the only food the worms would accept. Women, often in quiet rural communities, tended the trees and fed the silkworms by hand. In darkened rooms they watched, as the worms spun their cocoons, glistening white pods, each holding a mile of continuous thread. But the work was far from done. The cocoons were gently boiled to loosen the fibers without breaking them. Then, with steady hands, the silk threads were unwound, often several at once, to create a single strong strand. This thread would be dyed, woven, embroidered, and finally worn, not by the spinner, but by the elite. In the days of the Han Dynasty, the production of silk was a state matter. Families who raised silkworms were sometimes exempt from taxes. Knowledge of the craft was passed from mother to daughter in whispers over generations. To outsiders, the fabric seemed magical, soft as breath, luminous without light. It shimmered like water and moved like mist, and the mystery of its origin only made it more desirable. China knew this and protected it fiercely. To share the secret of silk-making was treason, punishable by death. For centuries the empire succeeded. The worm and its precious thread remained hidden behind the bamboo curtain, and so in quiet villages and imperial workshops the silk grew, not just as cloth, but as a symbol of a civilization that could spin power from something so fragile. It began with a leaf. Spies, smugglers, and silk eggs. No secret stays hidden forever, not even in the most guarded empire. And for a secret as precious as silk, the world was willing to wait and to steal. For centuries, other nations wondered. Traders who touched silk in Roman markets asked where it came from. They guessed India, Arabia, but few knew the truth. The silk arrived, but the silkworms did not. Yet the desire grew. Whispers of the process began to spread, that the thread came from insects, that it was spun by worms. Still, without the worms themselves, the truth remained out of reach, and then came the tales. One of the most famous spoke of two monks, Byzantine, wise and determined, who journeyed east in the 6th century under the orders of Emperor Justinian. Disguised as pilgrims, they made their way deep into China, and after months, or perhaps years, they returned, not with cloth, but with life. Hidden in hollowed-out bamboo canes were silkworm eggs, carefully wrapped and preserved. Along with them came the knowledge of how to raise them, how to spin the thread, how to keep the worms alive long enough to weave wealth from their labor. Whether this story is entirely true, we may never know, but what is certain is this. By the 6th century, silk production had reached Byzantium, and from there it slowly travelled westward. Other stories speak of princesses marrying into foreign lands, smuggling silk cocoons hidden in their hairpieces or stitched into their robes. Some say spies disguised as merchants slipped away with samples of the worm's eggs, risking death to bring home the empire's most prized secret. These weren't just acts of curiosity, they were acts of transformation. With every secret smuggled out, China's monopoly weakened, and the world grew wider. Yet even as silk spread, the reverence for its origins remained. The East was still seen as the source of purity, of perfection, of the silk that shimmered like moonlight. And while the secret of the worm eventually escaped, the mystery of silk itself, the way it felt, the way it moved, the way it whispered, when touched, never truly left China's hands. Draped in desire. In every palace, in every court where silk arrived, it changed the air. It wrapped emperors, queens, generals and saints, not just in comfort, but in power. In Rome, the senators debated silk. Some praised its beauty. Others condemned its extravagance. Pliny the Elder grumbled that Roman women wore nothing, so sheer was the fabric. But still they wore it. Because silk did something wool could not, it spoke without words. It said wealth. It said taste. It said, I have touched something from the edge of the world. In Persia, silk was woven into robes embroidered with symbols of kingship. Lions, stars, fire altars, all stitched in golden thread across midnight-coloured cloth. It wasn't just fashion, it was faith. To wear silk was to walk in the shadow of gods. In India, silk merged with local traditions, dyed in brilliant reds, woven into temple garments draped across statues during rituals. Its softness was seen not as weakness, but as sacred. The skin of the divine deserved no less. Even in the far north, in lands touched by snow, Viking burial sites have revealed scraps of silk. Tattered, weathered, but unmistakable. It had travelled across deserts and mountains to rest in the ground with the dead, treasured to the very end. Silk was not just fabric, it was memory. It was prestige, it was longing. For the merchant, it meant wealth. For the bride, it meant beauty. For the ruler, it meant the reach of their voice. And for the commoner who touched it, even once, it meant wonder. Across continents, silk became a universal language, one that didn't need translation, only admiration. Threads across thrones. Diplomacy has always involved gifts, but when silk entered the room, the message became clearer. It said, "We value peace, we offer grace, we come from power." Chinese emperors sent bolts of silk to distant kingdoms, not just for trade, but for tribute. It was soft enough to fold, light enough to carry, and valuable enough to settle disputes without drawing a sword. Han ambassadors gave silk to nomadic chieftains in exchange for calm borders. Tang rulers sent robes to Japanese courtiers who wore them with reverence. In Korea, silk became part of royal ceremony. And in the Islamic world, caliphs and scholars alike treasured it, sometimes turning it into pages for sacred texts. Silk was more than fashion. It was a tool of politics. It moved in waves, carried by caravans, but also by intention. Kings wrapped their alliances in it. Queens wrapped their heirs. Even popes, centuries later, received silk as symbols of favor from the East. And through all this, the thread remained, unbroken. From the sericulture rooms in Chang'an, to the courts of Constantinople, to the bazaars of Baghdad, a single thread could cross continents. And in doing so, it carried more than fabric. It carried belief. That beauty mattered. That connection was possible. That the softest thread could tie together the hardest of thrones. In the end, silk was not about cloth. It was about trust, about prestige, about power shared in whispers, not commands. And as the sun set across the silk road and the caravans grew quiet, the silk still shimmered, folded gently in royal chests, waiting for another hand to touch it, another heart to be stirred by its impossible lightness. Chapter 8. Bandits, caravans, and the relay posts. Beneath the endless sky and above the silent sands, a slow procession moved forward, step by step, day by day. The caravans of the Silk Road did not glide like stories suggest. They marched, through wind, thirst, and time. To travel the Silk Road was not a journey of weeks, it was one of seasons. A single route from Chang'an to Central Asia could take months, often longer. Merchants, animals, guards, and guides moved together like a floating village, bound not by blood, but by endurance. The camel was the lifeline of the caravan. The Bactrian camel, with its thick fur, wide feet, and twin humps, was suited for cold nights and dry days. It could carry hundreds of pounds of goods and survive long stretches without water. And still, even these beasts grew weary. Their breath steamed in the morning cold, their hooves sank into soft sand. Some limped, some fell. All were essential. People too bore the toll. Traders wrapped themselves in layers of wool and linen to shield against the sun by day and frost by night. Skin cracked, lips bled, eyes burned from the glare. Food was basic: dried meat, flat bread, bitter tea. Water was measured by drops, not cups. Yet there was rhythm. Each morning, before the sun rose, campfires were stirred, packs lifted, animals coaxed into line. The caravan moved with purpose. Even in its silence, there were moments of wonder too. A moonrise over distant dunes, the sudden scent of rain in a parched valley, the shimmer of silk unpacked at sunset, glowing like a captured sunrise. These small beauties kept feet moving, but the road had no mercy. It demanded patience. It demanded presence. Each step forward was not a given, it was earned. And still the caravan moved, because beyond the sand, beyond the hardship, there waited markets, cities, and the promise of exchange, not just of goods, but of dreams. The relay stations of the Han, in the vast sweep of desert and plain, survival, depended on more than willpower. It depended on design. The Han dynasty, understanding this, built something vital along the road, the Yizhan relay stations. These outposts were lifelines. Placed at regular intervals, often every 30 to 50 kilometers, they gave shape to the route. They provided shelter, rest, and, most of all, certainty in a landscape that offered little. One of the best known was Shuangquanji. Tucked near Dunhuang, it was more than a simple rest stop. It had stables for weary horses, dormitories for officials, granaries for food storage, and guards to keep watch. Here, travellers could pause, eat a warm meal, tend to injured animals, write a letter, or simply rest in shade. The Han government maintained these posts with precision. Messengers rode between them carrying scrolls sealed with imperial wax. Fresh horses awaited at each stop, ready to run. Grain and tea were stored in anticipation of caravans. For the ordinary merchant, gaining entry required a permit. These papers showed where you came from, where you were going, what you carried. Without them, there was no shelter, no passage. But for those who followed the rules, the Yizhan system turned a chaotic wilderness into a network of possibility. Traders from Persia, India, and beyond could navigate not only by the stars, but by the expectation of rest. At night, lamplight glowed from the stations, soft and steady. Smoke rose from clay chimneys, voices, many languages, many accents, drifted into the desert air. Here, amid the dryness and danger, was a pause, a place to recover, a place to write down a thought, seal a message, and pass it on. The Silk Road was long, but because of these stations it was never entirely lost. Bandits and sandstorms. The Silk Road offered riches, but with riches came risk. Not all threats wore armor or rode in caravans. Some waited in silence, in shadow, or in the sky. Bandits were the road's oldest enemies. They struck fast and without mercy, emerging from mountain passes or hidden ravines. Some worked alone, silent and deadly. Others in groups, organized and bold. They knew the land, knew the schedules, knew where the caravans would slow, where they would sleep, where they were most exposed. To protect themselves, traders hired guards, men with bows, spears, and sharp eyes. Some were former soldiers, some were locals paid in food and promise, but even the best guard could do little if outnumbered, and so caravans learned caution. They moved in larger groups, they shared information, they travelled only at certain hours and rested in protected spaces. But not all dangers had faces. The desert had moods. Sandstorms could rise without warning, walls of dust that swallowed light and breath. The air turned red, the sky vanished, and all direction was lost. Animals panicked, people staggered, blinded, mouths filled with grit. Some travellers tied ropes between themselves, hoping not to lose each other. Some buried their faces in cloth and waited for the storm to pass. Others did not survive. Cold was another enemy. In the high passes of the Pamir Mountains, snow could fall even in spring. Ice crept into tents, fingers froze. Entire caravans were sometimes forced to turn back. defeated not by man, but by weather. And yet the road endured. Routes changed to avoid danger. Forts were built in exposed places, tunnels carved through rock. Local guides became more valuable than gold. Danger was never far, but neither was the will to overcome it, because beyond every mountain, every storm, every shadow, there was another market, another city, another destination just out of reach. And so the Silk Road continued, one careful step at a time. Letters, news, and whispers. Long before newspapers, long before telegraphs, the Silk Road carried more than silk. It carried voices, written, spoken, sung, and remembered. Messages moved faster than caravans. Riders on swift horses bore scrolls wrapped in waxed cloth, sealed by governors and kings. These messengers used the same relay stations as the merchants, but moved with urgency. They stopped only to switch mounts, drink tea, or warm their fingers before writing replies. Some messages were official, orders from the Han court to frontier generals. Others were personal, letters from sons to mothers, merchants to partners, poets to friends. Some arrived months after they were sent, some never arrived at all. But each one carried a piece of someone's world across vast and silent spaces. Beyond letters there was rumour. In oasis towns, around tea kettles and market fires, news moved like wind. The Parthians have raised taxes. The passes in the west are closed. A new road has opened near the southern hills. Some of it was true, some of it was not. But all of it shaped decisions. Even religion travelled in whispers. Monks walked from India to China, carrying nothing but scrolls and memory. They shared stories of compassion, rebirth, and peace. They stayed in monasteries, taught in caves, and turned words into wisdom. Musicians came too, strumming foreign instruments, singing in strange tones. Their songs told of distant rivers, forgotten gods, and cities lit by lamps that never flickered. Audiences gathered, not always understanding, but always listening. Ideas were not taxed. They did not require guards, and yet they changed the road more deeply than any goods. Because in the end, the Silk Road was more than a trail for merchants. It was a trail for thought. And though the traders may be gone, and the relay posts silent, the messages they carried, the dreams, the fears, the questions, still echo in the dust. Chapter 9. The Buddhist Pilgrimage. As the winds of trade whispered through the mountains and deserts of the Silk Road, they carried more than silk and spices. They carried something unseen but deeply felt, an idea, a path, a faith. Buddhism, born under the shade of trees in India, began to flow eastward, not by force, but by footsteps. And among those who walked this path, 2 pilgrims stood out like quiet stars in the desert night, Faxian and Xuanzang. Faxian set out in the early 5th century. He was already in his 60s when he left the eastern edges of China. His goal was not wealth or conquest, but truth. He had read the Buddhist texts available in China, but he found them incomplete, riddled with errors. So he journeyed west across frozen mountain passes and burning plains, seeking the original words of the Buddha. He reached India, where he studied for years in great monasteries, copying sutras and observing rituals. On his return, he faced shipwreck, storms, and hunger. But he came back with sacred texts and a story that inspired generations. A century. Later, in the 7th century, Xuanzang followed a similar calling. The Tang court forbade foreign travel, but his heart burned with devotion. Secretly, he slipped past the border guards and vanished into the vastness of Central Asia. What followed was one of the greatest journeys in history. He travelled through what is now Kyrgyzstan, across the Hindu Kush, and into the great centres of Indian Buddhism, Nalanda, Rajgir, and Bodh Gaya. He studied under masters, debated with scholars, and filled dozens of carts with sacred manuscripts. 17. Years later, Xuanzang returned to Chang'an. He was welcomed like a hero. His translations and teachings reshaped Buddhism in East Asia, and his travelogue became one of the most vivid accounts of the Silk Road, filled with maps, customs, weather, and compassion. These pilgrims did not ride in luxury. They walked, starved, and prayed. They risked death, not to take, but to bring back. To preserve something invisible but enduring. Their stories remind us that the Silk Road was more than a trade route. It was a road of faith, a road where footsteps echoed louder than armies. The cave temples of Dunhuang. On the edge of the Gobi Desert, where sand swirls like a living thing and the land seems to hold its breath, lies a place unlike any other. Dunhuang, an oasis, a sanctuary, a portal to the past. Here, in the cliffs of the Mogao caves, travellers and monks carved silence into stone. Over centuries, they hollowed out more than 700 caves. Some were small, just enough for one monk to sit and breathe. Others were vast, echoing halls of painted ceilings and towering statues. They were all made for one purpose: devotion. Dunhuang was more than a city. It was a refuge for merchants needing rest, for monks seeking meaning, for artists called to beauty. It was a crossroads where cultures met not in conflict, but in quiet awe. Inside the caves, the walls bloom with colour, murals of the Buddha teaching under trees, visions of heaven, of compassion, of rebirth. Heavenly beings float on clouds offering flowers. Musicians with long-necked lutes serenade the faithful. The bodhisattvas gaze with infinite calm, and everywhere, scrolls, thousands of them, stored, hidden, forgotten, and rediscovered. They hold sutras in Sanskrit, Chinese, and Tibetan, letters from traders, prayers, tax records, medical advice, the full breath of life preserved in the dry desert air. The cave temples of Dunhuang remind us that art was not decoration, it was devotion, that meditation was not escape, it was presence, and that even in the harshest lands people carved beauty with their hands and guarded it with their heart. Dunhuang was not just a stop, it was a memory carved into stone, a still point where the noise of the world faded and only the eternal remained. Sutra and scroll Buddhism did not travel alone. It carried with it ink and brush, language and learning. As monks crossed the Silk Road, they carried not only teachings, but tools, and one of those tools would quietly revolutionize civilization. Paper. China had already invented paper during the Han Dynasty, but Buddhism gave it new purpose. Sutras, the sacred texts of the Buddha's words, needed to be copied again and again. Monks, often by candlelight, traced each character with reverence. Paper was light, cheap, and lasting, perfect for spreading faith. Before long, monasteries became centers of writing and translation. Indian monks taught Sanskrit, Chinese, Monks worked day and night to translate the teachings. Scrolls piled up. Some were small enough to hide in a robe, others stretched meters long. Each was a thread in a tapestry of wisdom. This love for the written word spilled into society. Literacy rose, not just for nobles, but for lay people. A farmer might not own land, but he might own a verse. A traveller might not know the stars, but he could read a mantra. Script became sacred. Calligraphy, a form of meditation. To write a sutra was not just to copy, it was to understand. Each stroke a prayer, each scroll a bridge between minds. The Buddhist embrace of paper helped create a culture where ideas moved faster, further, and with more precision than ever before. Philosophy bloomed, poetry spread, letters flowed along the same roads as camels and carts. The sutra and the scroll were not loud, they did not shine, but they changed the world, quietly and forever. The compassionate compass in the bustle of trade, the roar of wind, and the clash of kings. One might think the Silk Road was ruled by strength. But there was another current beneath the surface, a softer one. One born not of conquest but of kindness. Buddhism brought with it not just texts and statues, but ethics, a code, a compass that pointed toward compassion, toward balance, toward understanding. Merchants began to fund temples as acts of merit, not to gain praise but to offer shelter for travelers. Caravanserais were built with clean water, safe rooms and quiet spaces. The road became not just a place of profit but of refuge. Buddhist ideas filtered into local customs. The value of all life, animal and human, began to shape laws and markets. In some regions, traders refused to deal in goods tied to harm. In others, festivals blended local tradition with Buddhist rites, celebrating generosity and the turning of the wheel of life. Even the way people greeted one another shifted. A bowed head, hands joined. The gesture was not submission, it was respect. A quiet way to say, "I see you, I honor your path." The Silk Road was long, hard, dangerous, but the ethics of Buddhism reminded its travelers that every encounter was sacred, that every deal, every meal, every night under the stars was part of something larger. This quiet current shaped the culture of the road, not through force, but through presence. And in that presence, the road became more than a trade route. It became a path. Chapter 10. Paper and the Word. In the heart of ancient China, where the rivers moved like ink across the land and bamboo groves whispered beneath the wind, something quiet and extraordinary was born. Not a weapon, not a throne, but a page, a round. The year 105 CE, during the Eastern Han dynasty, a court official named Kai Lun gave shape to an invention that would one day stretch across continents and centuries. It began not with grand ambition, but with the humblest of things: mulberry bark, hemp, rags, and water. The process was delicate. Plant fibers were soaked, pounded, and mixed into a thin pulp. This slurry was then spread across a mesh frame, where the water slowly drained away under the sun. What remained, once dried and pressed, was a soft, thin, pliable sheet, smooth to the touch, yet durable. It was paper. China had long known writing. For centuries, words had been carved into bones and bronze painted on silk or brushed onto bamboo slips tied with string. But silk was costly. Bamboo was heavy. What Kai Lun offered was something new, light, efficient, and gentle beneath a brush. Paper was not an explosion. It did not arrive with trumpets or fire. It spread like morning light, slow, soft, persistent. First in the courts of the Han, then in monasteries, and eventually across the empire. Calligraphers embraced it, scholars welcomed it, storytellers, poets, record-keepers, all found a home in the blank space between the fibers. And though Kai Lun would never see what his creation would become, his gift would eventually carry not only Chinese wisdom, but the dreams and scriptures of the world. A page that began in mulberry leaves would one day hold the words of saints, kings, rebels, and lovers. Paper was not just an invention, it was an invitation to speak, to remember, to imagine. Scriptures on silk and rope before paper found its way into the hands of every writer and monk. The written word in China often relied on materials that were anything but simple. Silk was favored for its elegance. Its fine weave and fluid texture made it ideal for imperial documents and sacred texts. But silk was precious. A bolt could cost more than a year's earnings. The medium itself was sacred, which meant that every word laid upon it carried the weight of ceremony. Bamboo slips were another tradition, thick, heavy, and bundled with rope or string, each one etched with careful strokes, then stacked in sequence and tied. A single chapter could weigh as much as a brick. Travel with one, and you carried not only words, but weight. So when paper arrived, the monks knew. They felt it in their fingers, saw it in the quiet gleam of the fibers. Here was a new way to preserve the Dharma, a material that honored the sacredness of the word, yet allowed it to breathe. Buddhist monasteries became the first great users of Chinese paper. In cave temples, in dusty corners of mountain shrines, and along the caravan trails of the Silk Road, monks began to copy the sutras, the sacred teachings of the Buddha, onto paper. Not hastily, but as an act of devotion. Each stroke of the brush was meditation, each completed scroll a prayer offered to time. Paper allowed for something new, distribution. Texts once stored in a single temple could now be carried by monks across deserts and borders. Pilgrims tucked small scrolls into their robes. Missionaries brought them east and west into the heartlands of China, Korea, Japan, and beyond. The spread of Buddhism became the spread of paper, and the spread of paper became the spread of literacy, beauty, and contemplation. In every scroll unfurled beneath candlelight, a miracle unfolded, the meeting of silence, brush, and belief. The library of the desert, at the edge of the Taklamakan desert, where the cliffs rise like worn teeth from the sand, and the air carries the scent of dust and prayer, lies one of the most extraordinary places on earth, the Mogao Caves of Dunhuang. For centuries, these caves served as sanctuaries for Wai, travelers, artists, monks, and scribes. The walls still breathe with the colors of old stories, Buddhas beneath Bodhi trees, celestial musicians floating through golden skies, and bodhisattvas gazing gently at the world below. But behind one sealed doorway, hidden for nearly 1,000 years, lay a greater treasure. A cave filled not with statues, but with paper. Discovered in the early 20th century, Cave 17, later known as the Library Cave, held over 40,000 manuscripts, rolled, stacked, bundled, and resting quietly in the dark. Many were Buddhist texts, sutras written in Chinese, Sanskrit, Tibetan, and more. But there were also secular works, poems, contracts, schoolbooks, calendars, and letters. Some dated back to the 4th century. Why were they hidden? Some scholars believe it was to protect sacred texts from invading armies. Others think the scrolls were sealed as a symbolic offering, a time capsule of the spirit. Whatever the reason, the result was a miracle. Inside that cave was a living memory of the Silk Road, a paper trail that stretched across empires. The monks of Dunhuang had preserved not just religion, but life itself. They wrote about taxes, recipes, medicine, and dreams. They copied scriptures not to sell them, but to preserve wisdom in the face of time's erosion. And all of it, thousands of voices, was written on paper. When we read these ancient scrolls today, we do not just hear words, we hear whispers of travelers who stopped to pray, of teachers who explained the sutras to young novices, of a world that once breathed just as we do now and left its breath pressed softly into paper. From Baghdad to Barcelona, the story of paper did not end in China. It travelled through the Silk Road, through the hands of merchants and monks, through wars and gifts and wanderings, it reached the West. But it was in the Islamic world that paper found its second great home. In the 8th century, during the Abbasid Caliphate, paper-making knowledge arrived in the great city of Baghdad. Some say it came after the Battle of Talas, where Chinese artisans were captured. Others speak of trade, of learning exchanged in peace. However it arrived, the timing was perfect. Baghdad was no ordinary city. It was a jewel of the world, a place of light, books, and thought. The house of wisdom, a centre of translation and science, soon became a fountain of paper. Arabic scholars embraced it. They copied Greek texts into Arabic, preserved Indian mathematics, translated Persian poetry, and recorded their own breakthroughs in astronomy, medicine, and philosophy. Mosques, courts, and marketplaces all ran on the rhythm of the written word. Paper was easier to make than parchment, easier to carry than tablets, and easier to store than palm leaves. Libraries multiplied, calligraphers refined their scripts, knowledge bloomed. From Baghdad, the craft of paper-making spread westward, through Cairo, then into North Africa, and eventually across the narrow sea into Spain. Cordoba, Seville, and Toledo became centers of learning. Latin scholars began to read what had once only been whispered in Arabic, Persian, or Chinese. And finally, paper arrived in Europe. By the 13th century, mills were working along the rivers of Italy, France, and Germany. The printing press would come centuries later, but the foundation had already been laid, sheet by sheet, scroll by scroll. It began with mulberry bark, with quiet hands, with monks in candle-lit caves, and it changed the world. Chapter 11. The Mongol Peace. It began not with a trumpet, nor with fire, but with a sound that would echo from the edges of China to the gates of Europe, the deep, steady rhythm of hooves on earth. Across the open steppes of Mongolia, in a land of endless grass and cold winds, a child was born beneath the wide sky. His name was Temujin. The world would come to know him as Genghis Khan. He came from hardship. His father was poisoned. His family was cast out. He grew up not in palaces but in struggle, fishing for survival, fighting for loyalty, learning that unity was stronger than blood alone. From this life emerged a man who could read the landscape like a map and command men like a poet conducts verse through precision, rhythm, and vision. By the early 13th century, the thunder of Mongol horses began to shake the earth. Tribe after tribe joined him. Enemies fell not just to his arrows, but to his ideas. Genghis Khan understood mobility better than any ruler before him. His armies were fast, light, and disciplined. They moved like weather, appearing suddenly, overwhelming swiftly, and vanishing before retaliation. Cities from Central Asia to the Caspian Sea fell to his banners. Fortresses once thought invincible crumbled, but as the conquests grew, so too did something unexpected, a new kind of order. The Silk Road, long fragmented by war, corruption, and petty tolls, was beginning to change. The Mongols didn't just conquer, they connected. From the yellow sands of Gobi to the olive groves of Anatolia, a new empire rose, not built of stone, but of motion. And beneath the beat of horses came another sound, the quiet rustle of goods, moving freely, of people travelling safely, of ideas crossing borders for the first time in generations. The Pax Mongolica, what followed the Mongol conquests, was not merely silence, it was structure. Historians call it the Pax Mongolica, the Mongol peace. A moment, rare and fleeting, where trade flowed smoother than it had in centuries. Under Genghis Khan and his successors, a vast network of roads, outposts, and guard stations spanned from China's coastlines to the plains of Hungary. This wasn't a random scattering of territory. It was a system. At its core was an understanding that trade, when protected, built loyalty, wealth, and power without the need for constant war. The Mongols implemented a communication relay system known as the Yam. Relay stations were built every 25 to 30 miles. At each, fresh horses and supplies awaited. Messengers could ride day and night, delivering official letters across continents in mere weeks. It was faster than anything the world had known, but it wasn't just speed, it was safety. Robbery along trade routes, once common, now risked swift justice. Mongol law was harsh, but clear. Merchants were welcomed, protected, and even given official passports, paisi, that allowed them safe passage across borders. Caravans that once risked death at every mountain pass now found guards. Tolls were replaced by state-monitored checkpoints. Information flowed alongside goods. Cities that had grown silent with fear reopened their gates. Markets in Samarkand, Bukhara, and Tabriz filled with silk, porcelain, carpets, and spices. Muslim, Christian, Buddhist, and Hindu traders rubbed shoulders, not in battle but in business. For a brief window in history, the world felt smaller. Not because it had shrunk, but because it had opened, and the wind that once carried war now carried whispers of connection, merchants, monks, and diplomats. With peace came travellers, and the roads that once served only soldiers now welcomed a far more varied procession, traders, scholars, monks, and emissaries from every corner of the known world. Merchants from Venice sailed eastward, their ships heavy with glass and wool, eager to return with silk, tea, and jade. Among them was a man whose story would become legend, Marco Polo. He arrived not in secrecy, but as a guest. He dined at the courts of Khans. He wrote of cities with paper money, paved roads, and markets beyond imagination. To some, his tales seemed fantasy. To others, they were a map of wonders. Buddhist monks moved freely across Asia once again, travelling from India to China, from Tibet to Korea. Some carried scriptures, others carried relics, all carried stories. At each rest stop, each shrine, they shared teachings, not in conquest but in calm. Christian emissaries from the Pope rode east as well, hopeful of finding allies in the Mongols against the rising power of Islam. Some were received graciously. Others returned with awe at what they had seen, tolerance, diversity, and a level of administration that rivaled anything in Europe. And Muslim traders and scholars flourished. The Mongols admired learning. Cities like Baghdad, though damaged by war, regained importance as centers of Islamic culture and science. Astronomers, mathematicians, and physicians were invited to Mongol court. Their knowledge was prized. Their presence was welcomed. Each traveler added something to the road, a new word, a fresh idea, a different spice. The Silk Road became not a single path, but a weave, threads from many lands knotted by the hands of many peoples, held together by a shared breath of peace. A horseman's empire of ideas. It is tempting to remember the Mongols only for their swords, but that would be to miss the quiet genius of their reign. Beneath the banners and beneath the thunder of hooves, another legacy was forming, one of knowledge, exchange, and innovation. The Mongols were pragmatic. They did not seek to impose one religion or one language. Instead, they asked, what works? Who knows? And then they listened. They encouraged translation. Chinese engineers shared their designs with Persian architects. Muslim doctors taught Mongol princes about medicine, astronomy, and hygiene. Paper currency, pioneered in China, was studied and adopted in other parts of the empire. Bridges, aqueducts, and postal systems spread across once divided lands. Even cuisine traveled. Noodles from China found their way west. Dumplings took on new forms. Recipes blended spices from India, wheat from Persia, and meats from the steppes. And knowledge, silent, powerful knowledge, was moved like treasure. Libraries were protected, scholars were funded, instruments were studied, charts were copied. The Silk Road, under Mongol watch, became a circuit not only of trade, but of minds. The Mongol courts themselves became melting pots. In the capital of Karakorum, Persian craftsmen, Chinese scribes, Russian artisans, and Arab astronomers gathered beneath the same roof. Their work was not merely tolerated, it was celebrated. Here the empire's true genius emerged, not in uniformity, but in inclusion. Genghis Khan had united the world with war. But what followed, for a moment, was a symphony. Notes from many cultures played together with surprising harmony. And when the Mongol Empire eventually fractured, when the unity faded and the roads once again became perilous, their greatest legacy remained, not in walls but in bridges, not in conquest but in connection. Chapter 12. The Man Named Polo. In the late 13th century, somewhere behind the stone walls of a Genoese prison, two men sat in the fading light of a cell. One was a writer, the other was a traveller. Their days passed slowly, measured by shadows, on the floor and the distant echo of footsteps in the corridor. But within those walls a story began to unfurl, a story that would ripple across continents. The traveller was Marco Polo, a merchant's son from Venice, weathered by sea, scorched by sun, and lined by time. Years earlier, he had set out with his father and uncle on a journey across Asia, a journey that would last nearly a quarter of a century. Now, years later, he found himself in chains, a prisoner of war after a naval battle between Venice and Genoa. His cellmate was Rustichello, a romance writer from Pisa, fluent in tales of knights and kingdoms. With parchment in hand, he listened as Polo began to speak. The stories did not begin small. Polo spoke of lands beyond deserts and mountains, of emperors dressed in silk, of cities with paper money and coal-fired baths, of palaces built so wide no man could see both ends at once. He spoke of the court of the great Khan, of jade markets, of black stones that burned like wood. He spoke, and Rustichello wrote. But what was fact, and what was dream? Polo's words danced between detail and wonder, between observation and awe. To the reader it was not always clear, yet it did not matter. For what emerged from that prison cell was more than a memoir. It was a map of imagination, a glimpse into Cathay, China, through the eyes of a man who had walked its roads and marvelled at its grace. Whether every word was true became less important than the vision it painted. A world beyond the sea. A road paved in silk. A man named Polo, the great Khan's court, in the heart of Cathay, where the rivers glittered like mirrors and the wind carried the scent of jasmine and spice. Marco Polo arrived at the court of the most powerful man on earth, Kublai Khan. It was not a place, it was an empire within walls. The palace stretched farther than the eye could follow, its gates carved from sandalwood, its roofs gilded with gold. Hundreds of courtiers in robes of every colour moved like waves beneath silk banners. Musicians played lutes from Persia, scholars debated in Sanskrit and Chinese, and at the centre of it all sat the Khan. He was not the barbarian Polo had imagined. He was a scholar, a planner, a visionary. Kublai Khan had inherited the Mongol conquests, but he had transformed them. He ruled not with fear, but with administration. Cities thrived under his gaze, roads were rebuilt, taxes collected. The Silk Road, once fractured by war, now flowed with goods and people. Polo described the Khan not as a tyrant, but as a man of impossible curiosity. He listened to his advisers with care. He summoned artists, engineers, and monks he sought. Knowledge the way others sought gold. For 17 years, Polo served in the Khan's court as a messenger, a diplomat, a witness. He travelled through Yunnan, Tibet, and even into the southern seas. He saw pagodas lit by lanterns. He met Buddhists who meditated for days without food. He crossed deserts where the sand sang in the wind, and rivers dried before morning. Through Polo's eyes, the Khan's empire shimmered like a dream. It was a realm of balance, where Mongol strength met Chinese elegance, where foreign visitors found welcome, where knowledge was currency and wonder its reward. And when Polo finally asked to return home, the Khan hesitated. He did not want to lose the Venetian. But time moves on, and all journeys end. Still the court remained in Polo's memory, bright, alive, and unlike anything the West had ever known. Gold dust and porcelain dreams. When Polo's book spread through Europe, it landed not quietly, but like a spark in dry grass. People read it not as history, but as prophecy. It opened minds and stirred desire. The world Polo described was rich beyond imagination. Cities paved with stone, governed by logic, lit by lanterns, ships larger than any in Venice, bridges arched like rainbows, and everywhere goods that dazzled, jade, lacquerware, porcelain, silk. Europe, weary and divided, was entranced. Merchants dreamed of new routes, new markets. Royals envisioned alliances with distant empires, Alchemists searched for the secrets of Chinese paper and gunpowder. Cartographers began to redraw the world, not based on borders, but on Polo's words. Gold flowed westward, but more than gold, it was the image of porcelain, fragile, glowing like moonlight, that caught the imagination. China became not just a place, but a symbol of perfection, of paradise, of promise. Polo's descriptions were sometimes strange, sometimes flawed. He misunderstood rituals, he exaggerated distances, but his passion was real. And in that passion, the West saw a mirror of its own longing, for order, for adventure, for something beyond the narrowness of feudal life. Explorers studied Polo's route. They traced his path on their own maps. From the vineyards of Italy to the courts of Spain, his name became shorthand for wonder. Even those who doubted him could not stop reading, because the world he spoke of felt so close, so possible, and in every whispered retelling, Cathay shimmered anew, the book that opened doors. Polo's Travels, or Il Milione as it became known, was more than a book. It was a door. It opened for scholars who pored over its pages to understand foreign customs. It opened for traders who followed his footprints across deserts and ports. It opened for dreamers who imagined a land where justice reigned and riches waited. But most importantly, it opened for one man, Cristoforo Colombo, or as the world would later call him, Christopher Columbus. Centuries after Polo's death, a young sailor in Genoa read his words and believed. Columbus carried a copy of Travels with him as he sailed west in search of the East. In the margins of his copy, he scribbled notes. He believed Polo's roots could still be found, that the riches of Cathay waited just beyond the horizon. He was wrong about the direction, but right about the influence. Polo's book did not build ships or write laws, but it shaped minds. It showed Europe that the world was not just larger, it was grander, that people in distant lands lived not as savages but with beauty, reason, and depth, that the world was a web waiting to be walked. It also raised questions that echoed for centuries. Was Polo's account entirely true? Why did he never mention the Great Wall? Why so little on tea or foot-binding, but perhaps that is the wrong lens. Polo was not a historian. He was a bridge between worlds, between eras, between imagination and memory, and when we read his pages today, we do more than remember, we retrace. We walk gently along a road once lit by starlight and lined by silk. Chapter 13. Powder, Thunder, and Flame. In a quiet chamber deep within a Chinese Taoist monastery, surrounded by scrolls, powders, and ancient recipes, a group of monks once stirred the contents of a brass bowl. Their goal was not war or weaponry, it was peace, immortality. They believed that by blending the right minerals, metals, and flames, they could unlock the secret of eternal life. But instead of discovering the key to immortality, they made something else. What emerged from that bowl was a black, gritty powder, sulfur, saltpeter, and charcoal. When touched by flame, it hissed and sparkled. When confined, it burst with a thunderous roar. What they had created without knowing, it was gunpowder. It was a mistake, a divine accident. The earliest records of this powder date back to the 9th century during the Tang dynasty. At first it was called fire medicine, not for healing, but for its strange, explosive qualities. It wasn't used in battle yet. Instead, it lit up festivals, filled bamboo tubes with sparks, and stunned scholars with its raw, untamable force. But alchemy, as it often does, had set something in motion. Curiosity became experimentation, curiosity gave way to invention, and, though those early monks may have turned back to their scrolls in frustration, the powder they left behind would travel farther than any prayer. It would slip from laboratories into the hands of soldiers. It would leap from fireworks to warfare, and it would one day echo across fields and empires in a language louder than words. Gunpowder was born not in violence, but in a search for the divine. And in that irony lies one of the Silk Road's most powerful stories. The fire lance awakens. As dynasties rose and fell, the strange black powder moved from temple to army. What began as a curious spark became a calculated tool of war. By the 10th and 11th centuries, Chinese engineers had transformed gunpowder from a novelty into a battlefield asset. The first true weapon was the fire lance, a spear with a paper or bamboo barrel attached near its tip, filled with gunpowder. When ignited, it expelled a sudden burst of flame, smoke, and sometimes even shrapnel. It wasn't accurate, it wasn't even reliable, but it terrified enemies. And in the chaos of combat, fear was a weapon of its own. The Song dynasty, facing waves of invaders and internal strife, continued to innovate. They created bombs filled with gunpowder flung from catapults. They designed incendiary arrows, grenades, and even early rockets, some painted with faces to resemble dragons as they shrieked across the sky. Gunpowder was not yet dominant. It hadn't replaced blades or bows, but it had found its voice, a deep, low boom that echoed through valleys and left smoke hanging in the air like a warning. The knowledge was guarded. Recipes were kept secret, passed among generals and artisans in whispers, but secrets, like smoke, are hard to contain. Merchants began to hear rumors, travelers saw flashes on distant battlefields, and, slowly, as silk and porcelain crossed borders, so too did the black powder. In the East it had been medicine. In the Middle it had become fire, and soon it would become something else entirely, smoke on the steppes. When the Mongols swept across the world in the 13th century, they brought with them more than horses and arrows. They were not just warriors, they were gatherers of knowledge. As they conquered cities, they spared craftsmen, engineers, scholars, and among the many things they collected was gunpowder. They encountered it in China, witnessed its flashes in sieges, its hiss in the air, its deadly burst behind fortress walls. And with typical Mongol efficiency, they adapted it. The Mongols didn't invent the technology, but they spread it. They carried Chinese engineers with them as they moved westward, through Central Asia, across Persia, into the Middle East. These engineers built gunpowder weapons for Mongol generals, teaching them how to use fire to breach stone, how to mix the powders just right, how to terrify armies before the battle even began. At the siege of Baghdad in 1258, Mongol forces used firebombs and early explosive shells to weaken the city's defenses. Baghdad, once a beacon of knowledge and beauty, fell beneath smoke and steel. It was a dark moment, but it showed the world what the new Mongol Empire could do. And in their camps beside maps and banners, the black powder travelled in leather sacks and clay jars, carried not as a symbol of destruction, but as a tool of rule. Gunpowder spread not through peace, but through conquest. But it spread. From the mountain fortresses of Persia to the deserts of Syria, Whispers of it passed from trader to trader, caravan to caravan, and then, slowly, inevitably, it reached the West. When Europe heard the boom, for centuries European armies had marched with swords, lances, and longbows. War was loud, but it had a rhythm. It was a clash of iron, a whirl of horses, a flight of arrows. But in the mid-14th century, at a place called Crécy in northern France, the rhythm changed. The English and French faced off in a field scarred by mud and tension. The longbowmen of England stood ready, but among their ranks was something new: small, crude cannons, iron tubes propped on wooden frames, filled with powder and stone balls. When the battle began, these cannons spoke there. Voices were rough, unrefined, a series of booms and bursts that sent shivers down the French lines. The noise was unfamiliar, the smoke confused, the explosions, though not yet precise, caused chaos. Crécy was not won by cannons alone, but they had arrived. Europe had heard the boom. In the decades that followed, cities fortified their walls. But the new weapons made those walls vulnerable. Castles that had stood for centuries were no longer safe. Knights in shining armor found that steel could not stop flame. Gunpowder changed everything. It ended the age of chivalry. It rewrote the rules of siege and defense. It birthed a new kind of warfare, louder, faster, and harder to escape. Europe, once behind in this quiet arms race, began to innovate. Foundries emerged, cannons grew larger, muskets were born, and within a century, gunpowder was no longer new. It was necessary. The alchemists of China had searched for eternal life. Instead, they had given the world the power to end it in an instant, and across every continent, the Silk Road had carried their mistake. But it had also carried a truth, that no invention, no matter its origin, stays where it is born. It travels. Chapter 14. The Plague Road. It began, as many dark stories do, with silence, then rumours, then bodies. In the year 1346, in the distant Crimean port of Kaffa, perched along the Black Sea, something invisible crept ashore. The city was under siege. Mongol armies, camped outside the walls, hurled stones over the fortifications. But these were no ordinary weapons. The stones carried something more terrifying than iron: death itself. The plague had reached the Mongol soldiers, and when they began to die in droves, some accounts say their bodies were catapulted into the city as a grim message, or perhaps a desperate act. Inside Kaffa, panic swelled. Rats scurried through alleyways, fleas bit skin, and people began to cough. But even worse than the sickness itself was what followed: the caravans, the ships. Italian merchants, desperate to flee, boarded vessels bound for Constantinople, for Sicily, for Venice. They carried chests of silk and spice, but hidden among the bolts of cloth and beneath the timbers, stowed away in sacks of grain, were infected rats and fleas. The wind blew westward, and the whispering sickness followed. At first, no one understood. The fevers came fast. The swellings in the neck and groin grew black, hard and pulsing. The coughing brought blood, and often, within 3 days, death. This was not just disease. It was terror with legs crawling across the trade routes of the world. What began on the Silk Road as commerce would now become a path of mourning, and there was no turning back. The shadow over Europe. The plague did not march like an army. It crept, a whisper in a port city, a merchant who fell ill in a village, a monk who collapsed mid-sermon. One by one, then in waves, towns fell silent. From the Mediterranean ports of Messina and Genoa, the sickness rode northward, across Italy's stone bridges, through France's vineyards, into the alleys of London. By 1347 it had reached the heart of Europe. By 1351 nearly all of it lay in its grip. It spared no one. Kings and peasants died alike. Monasteries, once places of prayer, became graveyards. Fields were left unharvested, homes abandoned, bells rang not for weddings but for burials. It was called many things: the Great Mortality, the Pestilence. Only later would it be known as the Black Death. And still the trade routes continued. Ships docked, merchants exchanged goods, caravans arrived with silk and porcelain, but unknowingly delivered something else entirely: rats, fleas, breath. Death travelled tucked in every corner of human movement. Some cities tried to shut their gates. Others imposed quarantines, 40 days of isolation, hence the word quarantine from the Italian 40 giorni. But it was too late. The wind itself seemed to carry the disease. It moved faster than fear, and fear moved faster than reason. In some villages, entire populations vanished. A priest might bless 500 corpses in a week, then fall himself. Doctors ran. Mothers wept. Children disappeared into forests, hoping to escape what they could not see. Trade routes, once the veins of civilization, had become arteries of sorrow, and still the wheels turned. Doctors, demons, and despair. When the world began to darken, people searched for light. They looked for cause, for cure, for comfort. But none came. Medicine in the 14th century was fragile, rooted in balance, in bloodletting, in astrology. Some believed the plague was caused by bad air, by the alignment of the planets, by sin. Others saw it as divine punishment, a reckoning. Doctors wore bird-like masks stuffed with herbs, hoping to filter the poison from the air. Their robes were waxed, their tools long, but they could not stop the tide. The image of the plague doctor became a symbol, not of healing, but of helplessness. Flagellants roamed from town to town, whipping themselves in public displays of penance. They sang hymns, called for repentance, begged the skies to relent, but the skies remained silent. In desperation, some communities turned on outsiders, accusing Jews, foreigners, lepers. Pogroms followed, fires were lit, innocents burned alongside. Fear. Yet even in this despair, humanity endured. Monks still prayed. Mothers still held their children. Neighbors shared what little food they had. In some towns, survivors banded together, burying the dead, caring for the sick, ringing bells in the night. The darkness did not erase kindness. It made it shine more clearly. And while medicine failed, memory did not. Artists painted what they saw. Writers scribbled notes in the margins of crumbling texts. Eyewitnesses left behind a chorus of voices, haunting, honest, human. They did not understand the disease, but they understood grief. And in doing so, they left a record of survival, even in sorrow. A world transformed by death. When the Black Death finally loosened its grip, the world it left behind was not the same. Europe had lost nearly 1/3 of its population, some say more. Empty homes lined once bustling streets. Fields returned to wilderness. The silence was deep, aching, unfamiliar. But from this emptiness change emerged. With fewer people, labour became scarce. Peasants, once bound to the land, now held bargaining power. Wages rose. The feudal order, built on inherited power, began to crumble. Serfs demanded freedom. Towns grew more independent. Cities, once walled by hierarchy, began to open to new ideas. Religiously, the plague shook faith. The church had failed to protect. Clergy had died or fled. Mysticism rose. So did doubt. New movements took root, quietly at first, but with a slow certainty that would echo centuries later in reform and revolution. Even art changed. Before the plague, beauty dominated. After, mortality did. Paintings featured skulls, hourglasses, the dance of death, a reminder that time spared no one, and science, though still in its infancy, gained traction. People began to ask questions, to challenge old ideas, to measure, to wonder. The seeds of the Renaissance, once dormant, began to stir. Trade resumed, the Silk Road reopened. But something was different. It wasn't just goods that moved, but ideas, beliefs, fears, hopes. The road, once filled with silk and song, now carried memory. A memory of death, but also of rebirth. Chapter 15. Spices and Sailors. It was a quiet morning in May, in the year 1453, when the sound of cannon fire cracked open the future. The city of Constantinople, once the eastern jewel of the Roman Empire, had stood for over 1,000 years. Its massive walls, thick with history and stone, had repelled countless armies. But this time was different. From the east came Sultan Mehmed II and the armies of the rising Ottoman Empire. They brought with them a force modern in its firepower and unrelenting in its aim. For weeks they laid siege to the city, pounding its walls with the thunder of cannon and the weight of resolve. Then finally, on May 29th, the walls were breached. The city fell. The cross was lowered. The crescent rose. To the Ottomans, it was a triumph. To Christendom, it was a wound. But to the merchants of Europe, it was a catastrophe. For centuries, Constantinople had been the key that unlocked the East. Through its markets and ports flowed the riches of Asia, silk, porcelain, tea, and most coveted of all, spices. Black pepper from India, cinnamon from Ceylon, cloves and nutmeg from islands that barely had names on Western maps. These treasures passed from east to west, often changing hands dozens of times, each exchange adding weight to their price. But now, with the Ottomans in control of Constantinople and the eastern Mediterranean, the old land routes grew dangerous, expensive and uncertain. Europe, eager for spice, was forced to ask a new question. If we cannot go through the east, can we go around it? And so began the greatest redirection of human movement the world had ever seen, not overland, but by sea. The sea becomes a road. The Atlantic Ocean, for centuries regarded as a restless border between known and unknown, suddenly became a gateway to possibility. On the coasts of Portugal and Spain, shipbuilders worked day and night. Sailors trained for journeys that had no maps. Monarchs, seduced by the promise of wealth, offered patronage and prayer to men who dared defy the horizon. Portugal moved first. Small, determined, and gazing toward Africa, the Portuguese hugged the coast, inching southward year by year. They rounded capes, braved storms, and mapped currents. By the time Bartolomeu Dias reached the Cape of Good Hope in 1488, the dream felt real. 10 years later, Vasco da Gama, following the curve of Africa's edge, arrived in Calicut, India, returning, with ships heavy with spices and stories. The sea had become a road. Spain, unwilling to watch from the shore, gambled on another route entirely. In 1492, with the backing of Queen Isabella and King Ferdinand, Christopher Columbus sailed west, not east, believing Asia lay just beyond the Atlantic's blue veil. He found not India, but the Americas. He did not find cloves, but gold. Still, the rush was on. Other nations followed. England, France, the Dutch. New ports sprang to life. Goa, Malacca, Macau. And everywhere, spices moved like whispers. Cloves tucked in ship hulls. Nutmeg traded for cannon. Pepper exchanged for pearls. The sea was no longer a barrier. It was a highway. And Europe, once a fringe to the Silk Road, now became its rival. The East was still the prize. But the way there had changed forever. The ghost of Marco Polo. Long before ships found India, before Columbus crossed oceans, there was another traveller, one who walked, observed, and returned with wonders that blurred the line between fact and fable, Marco Polo. His book, The Travels, had been copied, translated, debated, and doubted for nearly 2 centuries. But by the 15th century, it had become more than a travelogue. It was a compass. To young explorers, Polo's descriptions of the riches of Cathay, China, and his accounts of Kublai Khan's empire were intoxicating. Gold-roofed palaces, cities larger than anything in Europe, spices piled in markets like sand. His words planted seeds in minds that would one day become sails on ships. Even as cartographers redrew the world, Polo's ghost lingered on their parchment. His roads became oceans, his deserts became coastlines, his memories became maps. Columbus, as he prepared for his journey west, carried a well-worn copy of Polo's book. He believed Cathay lay just across the Atlantic. He was wrong in distance, but not in direction, for he understood something deeper. The East was not just a place. It was a dream, a promise, a mirror in which the West saw its future, wealth, prestige, glory. Polo had walked the Silk Road. Now sailors followed his shadow on the water. In a sense, the Silk Road did not end. It simply changed texture, from dust to wave, from caravan to galleon, and through it all Marco Polo's words kept whispering, "There is more." Spices that changed the world. To us now, spices are familiar. A pinch of cinnamon on dessert, a sprinkle of pepper on pasta, a clove tucked into holiday baking. But once, these were treasures. Spices were not just flavor, they were medicine, magic, wealth. In medieval Europe, black pepper was worth its weight in gold. Nutmeg was said to ward off plague. Cloves freshened breath, perfumed rooms, and preserved meat. Cinnamon was carried in royal processions. Saffron was bright as sunrise and sold by the thread, and they came from far away. So far, in fact, that many didn't know where. The Maluku Islands, later called the Spice Islands, were tiny dots in the vast ocean, but they held what empires hungered for. When the Portuguese reached these islands, they did not simply trade, they claimed. Fortresses were built, naval battles fought, treaties signed with sword tips. Later the Dutch would seize the trade. Then the English. Then the Spanish. The quest for spices was not a journey, it was a scramble. Wars were fought not for gold, but for nutmeg. Entire colonies rose and fell over cloves, and yet, even as prices dropped, even as spices became more common, their power remained. They had reshaped the world. They had redrawn maps, fueled ships, and rewritten history. The Silk Road, once a line across the earth, had become a circle around the sea. And at its center, in a pouch, or a barrel, or a velvet-lined box, sat a few handfuls of dried leaves, barks, seeds. Simple, fragrant, revolutionary. Chapter 16. Tea, Porcelain, and Silver. In the soft mists that roll over southern China's hills, a quiet ritual unfolds. Small hands pluck tender green leaves in the early hours before the sun rises too high. These are no ordinary leaves. They are tea leaves, delicate, aromatic, and destined for a journey that will stretch across continents. Tea was not simply a drink, it was a culture, a rhythm, a way of life. In ancient China, tea was first prized for its medicinal value. Over time it evolved into a daily ritual, a moment of calm between the noise of life. In the Tang and Song dynasties, tea ceremonies took shape, guided by principles of grace and respect. Hot water was poured slowly over leaves in ceramic bowls. The scent rose like incense, soft and earthy. Tea became poetry, a symbol of refinement and hospitality. But tea did not stay hidden in China's valleys. As trade routes stretched farther west, so did the tea. Caravans carried it overland to Central Asia. Ships ferried it from the southern ports to Japan, to Southeast Asia, and beyond. By the time of the Ming dynasty, tea had become a cornerstone of China's economy. The state regulated its production. Taxes were paid in tea bricks. Tea farmers flourished or failed based on the whims of harvest and market demand. In Europe, when tea finally arrived, it caused a quiet revolution. By the 17th century, nobles in London and Amsterdam were sipping tiny cups of the bitter, exotic brew. They added sugar, then milk. Tea houses opened. Tea became fashionable, then essential. It was no longer just a drink. It was identity. It was power. It was profit. In China, it remained sacred. In Europe, it became commerce. And between the two worlds, the Silk Road, now filled with ships as much as camels, carried this leaf across oceans and empires. White gold on the table, while tea was warming cups and hearts, another Chinese treasure was dazzling eyes, porcelain. Smooth, cool to the touch, and almost impossibly white, porcelain was called white gold in the West. Its elegance was unmatched, its secret deeply guarded. Porcelain had been made in China for centuries, refined in the fiery kilns of Jingdezhen, the city of porcelain. There, artisans shaped kaolin clay into thin bowls, plates and vases. They painted them with cobalt blue, glazed them until they shimmered, and fired them at temperatures that rivaled volcanic heat. The result was strong yet delicate, humble yet magnificent. In Europe, no one could match it. Early attempts crumbled, cracked, or turned muddy. The secret recipe was unknown, a mystery wrapped in fire and clay. And so Chinese porcelain became one of the most desired commodities in the West. European monarchs collected it, aristocrats dined with it. Even ordinary households saved up for a single cup or dish. Ships left Canton and Macau loaded with blue and white ware. In return, Europe sent silver, lots of it. The demand was endless. Porcelain became not just art or utility, it became currency, a sign of refinement, a marker of trade. Eventually Europe cracked the code. In Meissen, Germany, alchemists and potters finally recreated the magic. Factories followed in France and England. But by then the love for Chinese porcelain had already reshaped global markets. Styles were copied, patterns were mimicked. Still, The originals held their charm, a memory of a world that once spun on the axis of beauty and craftsmanship. Silver ships and hidden vaults. As porcelain and tea moved east to west, something else moved in the opposite direction. Silver, tons of it, flowing not just as currency, but as lifeblood. In the Americas, Spain had struck vast deposits of silver in the 16th century. Places like Potosí in present-day Bolivia became mines of miracles and suffering. Indigenous labor, enslaved and broken, pulled endless bars of silver from the earth. The metal was loaded onto ships carried across the Atlantic to Europe and then, astonishingly, sent again across the globe all the way to Asia. Why? Because China wanted silver. During the Ming dynasty, silver had replaced paper money. It was stable, trusted, beautiful. China had all the tea and porcelain the world desired, but it wanted payment in silver. Enter the Manila galleons, enormous Spanish ships that connected Acapulco in Mexico with Manila in the Philippines. For over 2 centuries, these ships braved storms and pirates to carry silver from the New World to Asia. It was one of the longest and most consistent trade routes in history. Silver coins, pieces of 8, flowed into Chinese ports. They filled the coffers of merchants and emperors alike. Vaults swelled, markets boomed, but this came at a cost. Spain grew rich, then unstable. Inflation rose. Colonial powers fought over mines and sea routes. And still the galleons sailed, slow, wide-bellied, packed with treasure. Some sank. Some disappeared. Others made history. In China, silver shaped lives. It paid for rice, it built homes, it married daughters. In Europe, it bankrolled wars and revolutions. In the end, this metal, cold and bright, became the silent engine behind the age of tea and porcelain. The merchants of globalization. By the 18th century, the world was no longer divided into isolated empires. It was one vast, tangled web. At the heart of it were the merchants, savvy, daring, often ruthless. They didn't wear crowns or carry swords, but they ruled oceans, maps, and markets. In London, the East India Company rose like a shadow government. It controlled ports, ships, and entire regions of Asia. In Amsterdam, the Dutch VOC, the richest company in history, did the same. In Lisbon, Paris, and Genoa, traders and financiers followed suit. They branded their goods, they shaped tastes, they introduced products not just as items but as desires. A porcelain teapot was no longer a vessel, it was fashion. A tin of tea was not merely a drink, it was status. Global brands were born. Symbols, stamps, patterns, and packaging all became part of the story. People didn't just buy tea. They bought identity. People didn't just use porcelain. They displayed culture. Marketing began to travel along trade winds. A merchant in Venice knew what customers in Cairo, Goa, and Kyoto wanted. A port in Bengal could receive orders from Boston. This was the beginning of globalization, not just in goods but in dreams. But behind this glamour was grit. Dock workers in Macau, porters in Lisbon, tea packers in Fujian, deckhands on wind-battered ships. The world's wealth moved through tired hands, bent backs and calloused palms. The merchants grew rich, the labourers stayed forgotten. Still their efforts changed everything. They stitched the world together. They built the paths we still walk today. and as tea leaves steeped in porcelain cups paid for in silver coins, the world turned a little faster, not just from east to west, but from isolated lives into one shared story. Chapter 17. Jesuits and the Astronomers. In a quiet corner of the Forbidden City, beneath the sweeping curves of tiled roofs and the ever-watchful eyes of dragon-carved balustrades, two men sat across from one another, not as conqueror and subject, nor as preacher and convert, but as friends. One wore the black robes of a European Jesuit, the other the silken scholar's robe of a Confucian official. Their names were Matteo Ricci and Shu Guangqi. Matteo Ricci had come from Italy, a man of both faith and mathematics. He had studied the stars and scriptures alike, trained in the logic of Aristotle and the love of Christ. In 1582 he stepped ashore in Macau, hoping not only to spread the gospel, but to understand the great civilization that lay before him. He learned Chinese, not simply to speak it, but to think in it. He dressed like a Confucian. He quoted ancient Chinese texts alongside biblical verses. Shu Guangqi, born in Shanghai, was a scholar official, a man of reason and principle. He had risen through the ranks of China's vast bureaucracy by mastering the classics, writing poetry, and solving problems. When he met Ricci, he found not a foreign preacher, but a fellow mind, a man who spoke of the heavens in numbers and of God with humility. Their friendship blossomed not through sermons, but through shared curiosity. Ricci introduced Shu to Euclid's geometry and Western maps. Shu, in turn, guided Ricci through Confucian ethics and Chinese traditions. Together they translated key texts, from Greek science to Catholic doctrine. It was not about conversion, it was about communion, and in that communion a rare moment of peace bloomed along the Silk Road, where East and West sat side by side, speaking not of power or conquest, but of stars and spirit. The Gospel and the telescope. In the early 17th century, when telescopes were just beginning to change how Europe saw the universe, the Chinese court began to look skyward with new eyes. The Jesuits, Ricci, Charles, Verbiest, and others, brought with them not just crucifixes and catechisms, but lenses, charts, and instruments built to measure the heavens. Astronomy held a sacred place in China. For centuries, the emperor's legitimacy was tied to celestial order. Eclipses were omens, comets foretold change. The imperial court employed official astronomers to study the stars and maintain the calendar, a task believed to align the harmony between earth and heaven. But the calendar had drifted. Predictions failed. Eclipses arrived unannounced. The court was uneasy. Enter the Jesuits. With telescopes in hand and astronomical tables refined by Copernican thinking, they offered accuracy that astonished the Chinese court. They predicted eclipses to the hour. They mapped stars with a precision unknown in Beijing. And so these foreign priests were invited into the heart of Chinese science. At the court, they demonstrated the heavens, not as divine mystery, but as divine order. They spoke of the cosmos as a great machine, lovingly crafted by a creator, whose logic was reflected in orbits and angles. To the Confucian mind, which valued harmony and moral balance, this was not blasphemy, it was beauty. Through astronomy, the gospel found a soft voice, not shouting from the streets, but whispered through math, reason, and celestial wonder. Faith and science, often torn apart in later centuries, here walked gently together under Chinese skies, calendars and canons. The Jesuits, for all their theology, were also practical men. They knew that to serve the emperor they must offer more than prayer. And so they turned to time and tools, two things the imperial court desperately needed. First came the calendar. The Chinese calendar was lunar-solar, based on the rhythms of moon and sun. But errors had crept in. Planting seasons faltered. Festivals fell out of step. The emperor, seen as the son of heaven, needed accurate time to rule justly. With the help of Shu Guangqi, the Jesuits reformed the calendar. They recalculated the year's length. They realigned the months. The reform was approved and adopted, a triumph of trust and collaboration. Then came the canons. In a time when piracy and border threats loomed, the Ming dynasty was not averse to defense. Shu Guangqi, ever the reformer, saw Western artillery as an opportunity. With Jesuit guidance, China began to forge cannons using European designs. Ricci's successors, like Johann Adam Schall von Bell, helped test and oversee their construction. These were not weapons of conquest, but symbols of exchange. Western knowledge tempered by humility met Chinese pragmatism shaped by tradition, and from this blend emerged tools of protection and a model of cooperation. Jesuits served as engineers, advisors, and teachers. They taught optics, hydraulics, geometry and ballistics. They printed manuals, they trained students, and in return they were given rare access to the Forbidden City, to Chinese thinkers, and to the soul of a civilization that had long looked inward. A meeting of minds. The story of Jesuits and the Chinese scholars is not one of dominance. It is one of dialogue. A slow, respectful meeting of minds. It is a story not often told in the chronicles of empire or conquest because it is quieter, but it is no less powerful. The Jesuits came not as colonizers but as guests. They learned before they taught. They listened before they spoke, and in doing so they found a different kind of influence, one rooted in mutual respect. Chinese scholars, many skeptical at first, came to admire the Jesuits' discipline and devotion. They saw in their science a mirror of their own, rigorous, orderly, and tied to a greater moral purpose. Some converted, others did not, but many engaged. Books were translated. Instruments were shared. Dialogues took place not in the battlefield, but in gardens and study halls over scrolls and star charts. There were disagreements, to be sure. The rites controversy, a later debate about the place of ancestor worship, would strain relations. But in these early decades, the tone was one of harmony. It was a rare chapter in global history, a moment when two civilizations vastly different in form and faith chose not to clash, but to connect, a time when missionaries became scientists and scholars became friends. In the end, the Jesuits did not remake China, nor did China convert the West. But in their meeting, something beautiful was born, a whisper across the Silk Road that reason and reverence could walk side by side, and that the stars above us shine not for one people alone, but for all. Chapter 18. The New Silk Roads. Long ago, the Silk Road echoed with the footsteps of camels, the creak of wagon wheels, and the murmured prayers of merchants crossing deserts and mountains. Today the sound has changed. The wind still moves over the steppes, but now it carries the low hum of steel wheels on metal tracks. Trains, long, heavy, and purposeful, glide where caravans once crawled. Stretching from the industrial cities of eastern China to the warehouses of Western Europe, these modern trade lines are part of a new chapter in an old story. In places like Xi'an and Zhengzhou, ancient hubs of Silk Road commerce, freight trains now begin their journey across the Eurasian landmass. They travel westward through Kazakhstan, Russia, Belarus, and Poland before reaching their final stops in Germany, France, and beyond. This route, once the domain of silk merchants and spice dealers, now moves containers of electronics, car parts, clothing, and medical supplies. But the spirit of the journey hasn't disappeared. These trains carry more than goods. They carry echoes of past empires, of distant connections, of dreams that always reached beyond borders. The landscape is vast and familiar. The open plains of Central Asia, once traversed by Marco Polo and Mongol riders, now blur past high-speed locomotives. Cities that had faded into memory, Korgos, Almaty, Samarkand, are alive again, reinvented as rail hubs, customs checkpoints, and centers of trade. Concrete replaces caravanserais, but the role remains the same. Pause, exchange, move forward. The iron rails follow old paths, not always in the exact steps, but along the same purpose: to connect, to transport, to remind the world that geography still matters, that land still links us, if we choose to build upon it. One Belt, One Dream. In 2013, on a visit to Kazakhstan, Chinese President Xi Jinping spoke to a university crowd about reviving the Silk Road, not with camels or spice ships, but with highways, pipelines, ports, and digital links. He called it the Belt and Road Initiative, a vision, a promise, a dream of reconnecting the world, east to west, through a vast, modern web of infrastructure and influence. The idea took root quickly. China invested in roads across Pakistan, railways in Kenya, ports in Sri Lanka, and bridges in Serbia. It signed deals with over 140 countries. Some projects were small, others were monumental. In Greece, China took control of the port of Piraeus, once a fading harbour, now a busy gateway between Asia and Europe. In Africa, highways carved through mountains and forests. In Central Asia, tunnels pierced the same terrains that had challenged travellers for centuries. To supporters, the Belt and Road is a grand return, a modern Silk Road that brings opportunity, trade, and development. It echoes the same ambition that once sent caravans through mountain passes and launched ships into the Indian Ocean. To critics, it raises questions about debt, dependency, and influence. But politics aside, one thing is clear. The Silk Road never truly ended. It transformed. China's dream is not just about moving goods. It's about building a network, a structure where power flows along routes laid by steel, fiber, and money, where ideas and images travel as fast as signals, where Beijing becomes not just a city, but a center, not of conquest, but of connection. One belt, one road, one vision, and underneath it all, the faint rustle of ancient maps unfolding once more. The silk that became code. Centuries ago, the Silk Road carried textiles, spices, and porcelain. Merchants measured their wealth in bolts of silk, pouches of saffron, and bags of silver. Today we carry something different, invisible, weightless, yet priceless. Code information has become the silk of the digital age. Data flows across the globe. Through satellites, undersea cables, and wireless signals, it moves faster than any horse, ship, or train. What once took months to carry by caravan can now arrive in seconds: a photo, a payment, a message, a map. In places like Singapore, Dubai, and Shenzhen, data centers have replaced old bazaars. These are the new crossroads where digital goods, knowledge, software, currencies are stored, sorted, and exchanged. Cloud networks are the new trade routes. Cybersecurity is the new caravan guard, and yet the pattern is familiar. There are still gatekeepers, still risks, still a hunger to connect, to learn, to share. Think of the path a single smartphone takes: mined cobalt from Africa, assembled components from Korea, designed in California, packaged in China, shipped to Europe, sold in Cairo, used to video call a friend in New York. Every part, every function, a thread in the global weave. The internet has replaced camels, but the purpose is the same: to bring distant worlds closer, to make space for dialogue, for trade, culture, and shared wonder. The Silk Road now runs on fiber optic lines and satellites, powered not by hoof or wind, but by electricity and thought. A network of light carrying dreams shaped in code. World stitched together. As we come to the end of this journey, we pause and look back, not just across chapters or centuries, but across the winding paths that brought us here. The Silk Road was never just a road. It was a mirror reflecting our desires, our ambitions, our fears, and our hope. From the first camel that stepped onto a desert trail to the first container that crossed a Eurasian bridge, this network has always carried more than goods. It has carried meaning, or it has asked, what do we seek? And what are we willing to share? The Silk Road stitched the world together with threads of silk, silver, spices, and souls. It taught us that no empire lasts forever, but ideas can. That language may change, but curiosity endures. That strangers meeting under desert stars or neon skylines can still exchange something valuable, not just in coins, but in kindness, questions, and respect. Today's new Silk Roads, whether built in steel, code, or dreams, continue that work. They show us that connection is not a relic of the past, but a need of the present. That we are still travelers, crossing boundaries, still seekers, chasing knowledge, still weavers, mending the world's edges. So if you ever stand on a train platform in Xi'an, or log on to a call with someone across the sea, or see a child drinking tea from a cup made in another land, remember the road, the one that was, walked before you, the one you walk now, the one that never truly ends. Because the Silk Road, in every age, is less about where we go, and more about how we go together.